The Reconstruction Era is a period in the history of the United States that has been continuously debated and reinterpreted by historians and political scientists over the late 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries. The Reconstruction Era followed the American Civil War and was a nationwide attempt by Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson and the Congress of the United States to reunify the fractured American North and South following a Northern victory in the Civil War. Reconstruction historiography is most commonly broken down into two very different interpretations: the Dunning School and Radical Reconstruction. The Dunning School was primarily inspired by the historical writings of John Burgess and his protege William Dunning, and was considered the historical standard for interpreting the Reconstruction Era during the late 19th century and much of the 20th century. The Dunning School focuses on the political drama of Reconstruction and aims to demonstrate how the corruption of then radical liberal Republicans in the United States Congress compromised the reunification efforts of the Democratic President Andrew Johnson. This compromise ultimately created a Southern environment that was overtly and purposefully difficult on then conservative Southern white Democrats, as well as needlessly friendly to undeserving African American freedmen. The Dunning School also separated Reconstruction into two distinct parts: Presidential Reconstruction, controlled by Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson in the late 1860s, and Congressional Reconstruction, shaped by Congress throughout the 1870s. The Dunning School remained the most popular interpretation of the Reconstruction Era until the 1960s and 1970s, when a differing interpretation, Radical Reconstruction, began to dispute the conclusions of the Dunning School. The primary argument of Radical Reconstruction is that white Southerners did not overtly suffer from the legislative actions of Congress during the era, as the Dunning School claims. Instead, Radical Reconstruction historians conclude that Congress's actions, while not universally positive, were far less negative than typically viewed by Dunning historians, and helped to protect and secure rights for African American freedmen. Radical Reconstruction partially takes inspiration from social reform movements such as the Civil Rights Movement. However, the works of early Radical Reconstruction historians are not examples of rewriting history to fit a more socially and politically correct narrative. Rather, these historians deconstruct and disprove the historical claims of the Dunning School with evidence that supports a more socially acceptable viewpoint. This video aims to chart the evolution of Reconstruction historiography from its infancy with the Dunning School to modern Radical Reconstruction interpretations. An analysis of John W. Burgess's Reconstruction and the Constitution, William Dunning's essays on the Civil War and Reconstruction and related topics, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, and Eric Foner's Reconstruction: America's Unfinished Revolution will be the primary focus of this video. The goal of this video is to demonstrate how and why Reconstruction historiography changed so radically from Burgess and Dunning's first school of thought on Reconstruction to the Radical Reconstruction movement under Du Bois and Foner that shaped Reconstruction historiography into what it is today. For Burgess, Reconstruction was a hopeful attempt at reunification that was destroyed by a politically motivated Congress who supported inferior African Americans over the well-being of white Southerners, stating that the work of Reconstruction was an executive problem. Without elaborating on how or why, Burgess offers his own support for the early executive Reconstruction methods of both presidents. In contrast, Burgess's analysis of Congressional Reconstruction is fueled by contempt and negativity. Burgess stands against Congress's interference in presidential Reconstruction because Congress increased the steps required for a Confederate state to join the Union, steps that included adopting unnecessary civil rights legislation for African Americans. Without evidence, Burgess defines the fallout of presidential and congressional disagreements as misery for the South, claiming that Congressional Reconstruction's victory meant that the South was disenfranchised through an influx of African American and carpetbagger voters who politically dominated the South, often through voter fraud. Burgess defines the better class of Negroes as those who voted for their old conservative Democrat masters instead of African Americans or white Republicans. Burgess neither supports nor condemns the actions of the Klan, but he does state that their goal was to force freedmen and their supporters out of their suffrage rights and political offices. Given Burgess's previous claim that the actions of freedmen and carpetbaggers helped to disenfranchise the South, Burgess appears to support the Klan despite his seemingly neutral presentation of their actions. Burgess's writing is not based on primary sources. The citations he does include are vague, making it difficult to properly review his research. Additionally, many of his more outlandish claims, such as African American civil rights not being a necessity and his exposure of widespread voter fraud, are not cited. Burgess's contemporary, William Dunning, expanded on these concepts in his own historical writings. According to Dunning, much of what made the South unique and free prior to the Civil War was removed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Hence, Dunning claims Southern states were not equal to their Northern counterparts because of the loss of their distinct freedoms. Through this argument, Dunning defends the slavery of African Americans and the denial of their rights as part of a state's freedom, and concludes that these freedoms were unfairly stripped away from the Southern states during Reconstruction. Both authors expect the reader's presumed natural racial biases to validate racist arguments that have no supporting evidence. For modern historians, the clear racial bias Burgess and Dunning held against African American freedmen is enough to question their conclusions made about Reconstruction as a whole. The duo's lack of credible citations and evidence to support their arguments only adds to their irrelevance. Burgess and Dunning doomed themselves to the confines of history, but not before influencing a generation of historians to confuse prejudice and racism with historical fact and evidence. When W.E.B. Du Bois published Black Reconstruction in 1935, the Dunning School was at the height of its influence. As a result, it is not surprising that the work of an African-American author that questioned the legitimacy of a popular school of thought on Reconstruction was largely ignored by the historical community. Du Bois primarily focuses on African-American productivity and activism during the Civil War and Reconstruction, shedding light on how African-Americans fought for their own freedoms and how black legislators in the 1860s protected and enshrined the rights of freedmen. Much of Black Reconstruction revolves around Du Bois' general strike thesis, the concept that African Americans won their slavery during the Civil War by sabotaging plantation owners' trust in the system. This was typically accomplished through work strikes. As Du Bois states,
open revolt of slaves could be met by beating or selling. Running away could be curbed by law and the police, but nothing could stop the Dodge slave from doing just as little and as poor work as possible.
Du Bois was one of the first writers to link the circumstances of freedmen and poor Southern whites together. Du Bois focuses on how the rich plantation class financially exploited and abused black and white laborers alike. Du Bois frames Southern Reconstruction as a battle between the oppressive rich and the honorable poor, a reflection of Du Bois' developing socialist beliefs. According to Du Bois, the great tragedy of Reconstruction is that the majority of poor white Southerners and African American freedmen could not put aside racial differences to unify against a greater evil. Therefore, rich white Southerners were able to regain their status and wealth quite easily after the war and continue their economic and legislative domination of the South. Du Bois' well-written prose introduced a new form of radical Reconstruction historiography to the historical community. Decades later, historian Eric Foner would cement Du Bois' school of thought as the historical standard for scholars and intellectuals. Eric Foner uses Burgess's and Dunning's lack of credible sources to his advantage and crafts a well-structured Reconstruction narrative that, through reliance on historical research and rigorous citation, disproves the sweeping claims of the Dunning School. Foner traces the historical facts of Burgess and Dunning back to Southern Democratic political propaganda that was spread throughout the Reconstruction era. These brochures, party newspapers, and racist pamphlets and cartoons had no basis in reality, yet effectively stirred Southerners against Congress and freedmen. The Dunning narrative propagates the idea that Southern whites were treated the worst throughout Reconstruction. Foner disputes this claim, arguing that rich white Southerners were quick to regain their money and land, faced little repercussions under President Johnson and Congress for betraying the United States, and used their own power to brutalize and essentially re-enslave African Americans. Foner refutes previous Dunning School writers' conclusions that Congress was primarily made up of radical Republicans. Foner claims that the crisis of Klan productivity and widespread legislative Southern racism is what radicalized Congress against Johnson. Foner claims that politics was the most widespread form of activism for freedmen in the post-war South.
Individuals feared the black vote would be swayed by demagogues. Freedmen would disprove these and other forecasts. They would demonstrate political shrewdness and independence, and the ability to use the ballot box to affect the conditions of their freedom.
With Reconstruction America's Unfinished Revolution, Foner effectively built upon the long-dormant arguments of Du Bois and fresh ideas from historians like John Hope Franklin and Alan W. Trelease to finally bury the Dunning School in the historical community. With the vast majority of modern historians in agreement with Foner, Reconstruction historiography has had the opportunity to become specialized, with individual historians using Foner's work as a basis to explore previously ignored aspects of Reconstruction. Foner commented on this in a personal interview conducted for this video.
In a nutshell, there's been a lot more attention to the role of gender, of women in Reconstruction, both white women, black women, how emancipation, how Reconstruction affected the family, affected the role of women, what happened with Native Americans in this period. So there's been sort of an expansion of this subject, the cast of characters, I think, that scholars are looking at.
Under radical Reconstruction, Reconstruction historiography is a truly exciting field, with new studies able to offer fresh and different examinations of topics that were previously ignored during the prominence of the Dunning School.